back to the NPTEL online certification course, Tribal Studies in India, Interdisciplinary Perspectives and Approaches. Today we are going to do our lecture number 45 on the title Tribal Middle Class. Now, this is a very important topic, particularly for those of us who are in the discipline of social science. And as we know, the question of tribal studies always have been understood largely in the context of tribes as an isolated backward community. But then over the last 60 to 75 years, we have seen that tribal communities have undergone significant socio-economic transformation, and this transformation was enabled by the formation of new kind of social groups within the communities, and that is essentially the emergence and the formation of middle class within tribal communities. Now, the study of tribal communities, or the study of Indian society, or the study of communities as such, particularly when one looks at disciplines like sociology, you will see that the question of class is very, very important. If one goes back to the pioneers of sociologists like Karl Marx, Max Weber, Emil Durkheim, you will see that they have engaged with the question of class, and that engagement with the question of classes primarily comes from the kind of socio-economic transformation that human societies have witnessed in the last 200 to 300 years, particularly with the onset of industrial revolution and then subsequently the emergence of capitalism, so on and so forth. In the context of India also, the study of middle class, who are the middle class, what kind of aspirations do they have, and what kind of social backgrounds do they belong to, continues to occupy a very, very important field within the discipline of sociology, anthropology, political science. And the middle class play a very, very pivotal role in terms of nation building, in terms of economic growth, in terms of urbanization, in terms of infrastructural development, in terms of occupational social mobility. So, understanding the middle class opens up a lot of things for us to understand how a community experience change, but also in terms of trying to understand the kind of change or who are the actors actually who actually led the kind of change that we see in society. Now, unfortunately, when one talks about the middle class or the study of middle class, it has been rarely studied in the context of tribal society. But through this lecture, what we will try to actually do is that we will see how the formation of tribal middle class has been very, very important, not only in terms of the middle class as a new economic or a new category within the communities, but also in terms of how the middle class within tribal communities have played a very important role in terms of asserting their identities, in terms of pushing some socio-economic interests or political interests pertaining to the communities. Now, before I go into the detail of my lecture, I also would like to give some kind of very, very preliminary remark in terms of the middle class in India. Now, in India, we know that when we use the term class, the first thing that comes to our mind is that we are using more class in the context of class is an economic category. Now, in that sense, a very simplistic but a very useful way of categorization that one can do, particularly in the context of India, is understanding the middle class in the pre-reform period, that is the economic reforms, and the understanding the middle class in the post-economic reforms period. Now, if one goes back to the pre-economic reforms period, that is still the 1990s, you will see that the middle class primarily comes from those who are working in the public sector undertakings, basically the government employees, and also some affluent communities in terms of the land owning class, the land owning caste, or even successful businessmen. So, in that sense, the middle class in the pre-reform period was very, very narrow. But in the context of the post-reform period, we began to see that the middle class began to widen its social base. Now, essentially because of the kind of socio-economic transformation that India has witnessed in the post-reform period. Now, in the context of tribes also, it is important to understand that the middle class as a category within tribal society is not a static category. Who are the middle class, what are the kind of aspirations that they have, what are the kind of political assertions that they make, varies from region to region, from communities to communities. So, economically, if one looks at who are the middle class, it is very difficult to actually define who are the middle class, but in India we use this very broad definition of defining the middle class as people who are earning an income of rupees 5 to rupees 30 lakhs. And today in India, round about 25% to 30% of India's population constitute the middle class, and the middle class is a very, very important class when one talks about any society or any country like India. So, to come to our lecture, the term class and tribe are contradictory terms, and it is important to spell out why these two terms are contradictory. So, tribes are mostly perceived to have a homogeneous social and economic life which is based on kinship, clans, or they lack any kind of social differentiation and hierarchy. Now, if you look at the social organization of tribal society, it is largely organized very horizontally, in a sense that tribal communities does not always organize themselves in a very hierarchical manner, and their social and economic diversification however has undergone significant transformation which raise questions about their categorization as tribes. Now, like I said, the idea of tribal communities also have undergone significant transformation, and today in the past the communities are pretty much very homogeneous and there was a lack of social differentiation. But over a period of time, with the kind of socio-economic transformation that the country India as a whole is witnessing, even tribal communities are not excluded from that kind of transformation. In that kind of context, what happened is that it necessitates to study the question of class formation in tribal society. Now, by and large, like I said, when one talks about the question of class, one has to go back to the development of capitalism, the coming of industrial revolution, so on and so forth. And it was the emergence of capitalistic economy or the establishment of capitalistic economy that began to divide society on the basis of the means of production, basically those who own the means of production and those who do not own. And this very capitalist system created a distinction between producers who generated surplus value and those who do not. Now, many social scientists make categorization on the basis of who owns the means of production. For example, Marx categorized them as the bourgeois and the proletariat, and likewise Weber also made such kind of distinction in terms of the status, the rank of a community. So, however, the middle class as a category has been defined based on the two key factors. One is the ownership of the means of production, whether they own land, whether they own factories, whether they own industries, and the production of surplus value. So, based on this very broad understanding, there can be probably four distinct categories in which one can make a segregation of who constitute the middle class. The first is those who owns the means of production and produce surplus value, that is the petit bourgeois. Second is those who own but do not produce surplus value, that is the bourgeois. Third is those who do not own but produce surplus value, proletariat. Fourth is those who neither own nor produce surplus value. And the middle class most of the time is placed in the first and the fourth categories. Basically, those who own the means of production, maybe in terms of land, maybe in terms of factories, and those who neither own nor produce surplus value. So, like I said, the middle class is a very, very fuzzy category. Some of them can be employed in the corporate sector, some of them can be employed in the government sector, some of them can be self-employed, a very, very successful businessman. Some of them can do different kind of economic ventures. So, it is a class category, it is an occupational category, it is an economic category, but then it is also very, very loose in terms of its definitions. Now, in terms of self-employment, the middle class is associated with the social differentiation within society. At the top are those who owns the means of production and earn income in the form of profit from the sale of the product. At the bottom are those who earn their wages by selling their labor, and those who fall in between these two are identified as the middle class. Now, this is another way of identifying or categorizing who constitute the middle class. And most of the time when we talk about class as an economic category, most of the time we fall back to the kind of distinction that Marx has made in terms of people who owns the means of production and people who sell their labor to survive, basically the working class. Now, a very broad distinction in terms of the old middle class and the new middle class. One is, in the old middle class we have, it consists of manufacturers, shopkeepers, artisans, independent farmers, peasants, managers, technocrats, professionals. In the context of the new middle class, you will see that intellectual, that is the non-manual labor, laborers rather than manual labor reflected in work, pay and working conditions. The old middle class share features of land and capital on the one hand and labor on the other, does not possess land and capital nor performs manual labor. Now, in the start of my lecture, when I was narrating the idea of class or the idea of middle class, then particularly in the context of India, I made this distinction between the pre-reform period and the post-reform period. Now, that kind of distinction becomes helpful when we look at this categorization of the old middle class and the new middle class. Now, in the context of the old middle class, if you look back at what was India like in the pre-1990s period, you will see that the middle class primarily comes from people who owns land, for instance, right, or people who are coming from who are engaged in manufacturing, who are shopkeepers, basically businessmen. But at the same time, there are also successful professionals. They are technocrats, they are engineers, they are teachers, professors, so on and so forth. But in the case of the post-reform period, we began to see a different kind of middle class who are far more aspirational, who are far more ambitious, and many a times they are no longer interested in owning vast amount of agricultural lands. They are mostly surviving, living off their wages. The kind of new middle class that we see with the information technology boom is a very, very good example as to how the changing character of middle class in India is also reflected by the kind of distinctions that we have here. So, in the context of the tribal middle class, now at the broader level, we can see that there is a clear trajectory in terms of how one can define the middle class at the national level. But in the context of the tribal communities, how does this happen? Who are the middle class, and what is the process of the emergence of middle class in tribal society? Now, like I said, most tribal societies in the pre-colonial period in particular, definitely there are social differentiations, but these social differentiations are not always very rigid. These social differentiations are not always very hierarchical. But over a period of time, with the coming of the British, the introduction of modern education, the different kinds of new systems of governance that were being introduced by the colonial state resulted into the formation of a new class within tribal society, which also means that social differentiation began to seep into tribal communities. Now, we will try to look at how this process of formation of middle class has taken place, particularly in the context of tribal communities. A very important starting point is the colonial rule. So, with the advent of the British rule in India, the system of private property and landlordism was introduced in tribal areas, by which ownership rights over land, over other resources were given to former kings, chiefs and revenue collectors. As a result, the original landowners became tenants, forced to pay high rents as landlords passed on heavy revenue demands to them. Unable to pay rent, tribals were often evicted from their land. Now, the outcome of this is that it resulted into the marginalization of tribal communities, and a phenomenon in terms of landlessness emerged, or what we can call the proletarianization within tribal society. Colonial rule in India affected all aspects of life, whether it is the social life, whether it is the cultural life, whether it is the economic life and the political life. But if you look at the impact, its impact continued to be felt and seen in every society, in every community. Now, in the context of tribal society, the impact was very, very profound, and this was evident in the way in which the Britishers altered the property relations or economic relations in tribal society. Now, in many parts of India, while there are a lot of social differences in terms of their identity, in terms of their belonging, in terms of their religion, in terms of their culture within and across tribes, but most of the time, many tribal communities have a very similar form of pattern or a very similar form of economic organization, which is they mostly follow communal system of land ownership. Now, with the coming of the British rule, what the British did was they imposed or they introduced and imposed a new system of economic relations through the form of private property and landlordism. And in the process, what happened is that the actual landowners become tenants, or the actual landowners are being displaced, and this resulted into a dispossession of tribal communities or the tribals by which they become landless, or what today most often we call it the proletarianization of tribes. This proletarianization of tribal communities was mainly caused by outsiders such as traders, moneylenders and colonial officials taking over tribal lands rather than by internal class divisions within them. So, in the last lectures, we have always talk about one issue which is very pertinent when we study tribal communities, is the question of land. Land is very, very central to their identity, to their belief system, to their culture. Now, the colonial system disrupt the kind of socio-cultural relations that tribes have with land. This disruption has created far-reaching implications in tribal societies. So, they were thrown off their land, displaced and uprooted, and were either employed as wage earners by landlords or in establishment run by traders and money lenders. With this, the demand for labor also increased, which was not only filled by the proletarianized labor alone, but also by workers who self-employed themselves on their farms. Now, you can see that, for example, a good example of this process of uprooting and displacing tribal communities is a good example is the tea tribes in today's Assam. Now, these tea tribes were uprooted from their lands, involuntarily taken to Assam to work in tea plantations, and they belong to Santhal, Oraon, and many other tribal communities who live in the Jharkhand, Bengal, Chhattisgarh region. So, basically the demand for labor in tea plantations resulted into the dispossession, not only in the dispossession, but also into the involuntary displacement of tribal communities to different parts of the country. Now, the first tribal middle class was composed of these self-employed laborers, and this class emerged in contrast to the process of proletarianization. The new administrative legal system and new economic enterprises led to the proletarianization, but also paved the way for the emergence of middle class in tribal society. Basically, this juncture that the new economic relations created by the colonial state unintendedly result into the formation of new class in tribal society in the form of the communities taking up new economic ventures. This proletarianization process was restricted to mainland India and was absent in the tribal societies of Northeast India. Over there, the process of social differentiation and inequality among tribals was based on religion and modern education. Now, by and large, the kind of disposition, the kind of uprooted, the kind of dislocation that I narrated was mostly confined to mainland India. Whereas in the Northeast India, which have a very, very strong tribal population, this process of disposition, this process of proletarianization was minimal, because essentially because the tribal communities in the northeastern part of India, they were not denied of their rights over their resources. So, their rights over their land, their forest, their water remains with them even during the colonial period. The coming of the Christian missionaries in the region, particularly in the northeast, the subsequent proselytization and access to modern education, it opened up new employment avenues in the form of religious workers and instructors, and later as school teachers and office assistants in institutions. This new employment was not only a source of income, but also a new basis of social status in society. Now, the colonial state, like I said, introduced many things, right? They cannot just govern, a colony, by themselves. So, they need to create, a new set of administrations. They need to create a new set of educated class who will help in the everyday affairs of the colonial state. Now, so they need basically a skilled educated workers, and which in turn open up new avenues of employment for the colonized. Now, in the case of tribal society, in the case of tribal communities also, this was what exactly happened. In a sense that the colonial state instituted different systems of governance, which in turn open up different avenues for employment, and they were not only a new source of income, there was not only economic diversification, but also these people began to be seen or occupy a sense of higher social status within the society. So, the older tribal middle class emerged by default as a phenomenon of self-employment along with the process of tribal proletarianization. However, the older middle class, which involved the self-employed and landowning category as well as marginal farmers, started to erode in post-independence era as they started supplementing their income to labor and ancillary activities. A more important point is that the new middle class in tribal society. So, in tribal society also, like any other society, there was this diversification of the social base of what the middle class. Now, a very important aspect or a very important class within the tribal society today is the educated class, and this educated class resulted into a new kind of social differentiation in tribal society, which the communities have not witnessed for a long time. So, the new middle class was different and associated with modern education. Tribal society did not have a tradition of reading and writing, but modern education among tribal communities initiated by missionaries in different parts paved the way for the emergence of new occupations which were absent before in tribal society. So, if you look at this is very, very evident in the northeastern part of India or in many parts of India, where the colonial state opened new schools, the colonial state opened new health centers, and by virtue of which there are section of population who began to be educated, who began to access the kind of new services that were made available by the colonial state. What resulted was that many people no longer live off the land. They began to move away from agriculture, take up new occupations, engage in a different kind of economic activities. And this particular group, although they were very small and very tiny during the colonial period, emerged as a very, very strong force, particularly from the 1940s onwards. And their role cannot be undermined in terms of their articulation, in terms of the kind of issues that they have raised, particularly when one looks at the socio-political history of tribal communities all over India. So, the growth of the tribal middle class has much to do with the policies and programs of the Indian state as well. So, we are coming to the post-independent period now. Now, in the colonial period, it was essentially the introduction of modern education that enabled the rise of or the formation of middle class. Now, in the post-independence period, what we essentially see is that the policies and programs initiated by the government of India has also opened up new opportunities, new avenues for the emergence of middle class. This is particularly evident in the reservation policy for scheduled tribes, which have been very, very fundamental in shaping the nature and type of middle class in tribal society. The provision of reservations in institutions of higher learning and state employment also complemented each other in this context. However, despite different kind of constitutional provisions for tribal communities, the middle class growth in tribal societies have been significantly very, very slow. This is primarily evident because the quota reserved for tribes in education institutions, especially government employment, could not be filled. Now, in the post-independence period, with the kind of affirmative action policies which were being followed by under the Constitution of India, there was a possibility that some tribal communities, some tribal individuals were capable of acquiring the benefits or the provisions, and they constitute the new kind of middle class in the post-independence period. But the growth, the expansion of this particular category within the tribal society was essentially slow, because there was very, very few takers or very, very few people who could actually even enjoy the benefits of reservation which is provided under the Constitution of India. Within tribal society, the growth of the middle class, especially the new middle class, has been far from even. The middle class is the most visible in northeast India, followed by eastern India. Elsewhere in India, it has remained dormant. Now, in the northeast, in the northeastern part of India, the middle class become a very, very strong force, and they become very, very evident. And this middle class primarily comes from the educated section. And therefore, in all tribal societies in northeastern India, whether it is in Mizoram, whether it is in Manipur, Nagaland, Meghalaya, Arunachal Pradesh, you will see that this middle class, they were very, very different in terms of their outlook, they were very, very different in terms of their aspirations. And unlike many other parts of India, particularly in the context of tribal communities, the growth of this new middle class is very, very important, very, very fundamental, particularly in the context of northeast India. So, the middle class in northeast India is very, very pronounced than the rest of the country and much more diverse than in mainland India. In mainland India, it is very rare to find tribes engaged in trade, commerce, business and shopkeeping. This constitutes an important segment of the middle class population in northeast India. Now, if you go to states like Nagaland, if you go to states like Mizoram, you will see that the economy more or less, particularly in the context of Mizoram, is controlled by the Mizo tribal communities themselves. And there are also a section of people who are in government services or who are educated. Now, in that kind of context, you will see that the social base of the middle class in Mizoram, for instance, in the state of Mizoram, for instance, is very, very vast, is very, very diverse. But if you look at many states in mainland India, you will see that the social base of the middle class is quite narrow, and they tend to come from a specific section. But in northeast India, the trend is very, very different, in a sense that the middle class can come from a business background, from an entrepreneur background, from an educated background, or even from those who are working in high positions within the government sector. So, they constitute a very, very diverse, they constitute a very, very fluid category. Now, like I said, a very important part which is very essential in the understanding of middle class, their role and their importance is particularly evident in terms of the kind of social movements that the communities have witnessed. Now, in my last few lectures, I have already talked about the question of constitutional provisions pertaining to tribes, and one of the questions that we constantly engage is the question of autonomy movements. And these autonomy movements also by and large fall within the broader social movements. Now, today we will look at how the tribal middle class have played a very important role in terms of articulating the political aspirations, the socio-cultural aspirations of the communities. So, the tribal middle class in the form of land owning cultivators, they played a very important role in several tribal revolts or struggle against the changes which was introduced by the colonial state during the colonial period. And during the freedom struggle also, tribal cultivators align or join movements with other exploited classes of the agrarian society and fought against the landlords for the security of tenure, reduction of rent or larger share of produce under a sharecropping arrangement by participating in peasant movements launched by communist and socialist parties. While the old middle class, they play a very decisive role in this kind of movements that were largely pertaining to agrarian movements, because it has to do with agriculture, it has to do with land, it has to do with the kind of economic systems that they were engaged with. But the new middle class, particularly who are coming from educated backgrounds, who are coming from different kind of occupations, they took a very important role in terms of articulating and asserting or directing new movements, specifically movements that demand political autonomy, including control over land, forests and resources. Now, when I say political autonomy, I am not only talking about governance, I am not only talking about administration. Autonomy in the context of tribes essentially is integrally linked with the question of social autonomy, economic autonomy and political autonomy, by which one cannot but talk about the question of land, the question of forests and resources when one talks about autonomy in the context of tribes. These new movements began to surface in the 1930s and the 1940s, and they continued in post-independence period. And the impact of this is that they reorient the society into a new mold, where this new tribal middle class articulated the kind of political demands. So, if not for the tribal middle class, today many states in the northeast or many parts of India where tribal populations are dominant, they may not have the kind of provisions, essentially because this new middle class were the first one to articulate a strong political positions pertaining to the communities. Now, the middle class played a very active role in the social movements. They have also been instrumental in peace negotiations and accords, thereby integrating people and regions within India. And at the dawn of India's independence, since the colonial state was administratively putting tribal communities outside of the larger national framework, in a sense that they were administratively excluded by the Government of India Act, and there was very minimal interaction between tribal communities and the non-tribal communities, particularly in areas which are defined as excluded areas. So, it was the middle class who played a very important role in terms of setting the terms and conditions for the nature of integration that was to happen in post-independent period. So, the constitutional provisions for tribals pushed towards the direction of tribal integration within the larger Indian society. Along with these provisions, there have also been provisions and policies regarding their representation in political institutions, state employment and higher educational institutions. Now, we have talked about the 5th schedule and the 6th schedule. Now, the formation of the 5th and the 6th schedule was essentially an outcome of the political mobilizations that tribal communities began to initiate from the 1930s, the 1940s, which later on culminated in the inclusion of these constitutional provisions that give some semblance of autonomy to the communities. And it was essentially the tribal middle class, the educated tribal middle class, who articulated, who made these kind of demands that enabled the constitution drafting committee, members of the drafting committee, to listen to the kind of positions that these tribal leaders are making. So, therefore, it is not to say that the people has no role. It is not to say that the illiterate class, ordinary tribal communities have no role to play in the kind of rights or in the kind of in the kind of provisions that are being granted to them. But what I mean to say here essentially is that it was the middle class who were at the forefront of these struggles, and they play a very important role in terms of voicing the concerns and aspirations of the communities. And tribals who have been able to enter these institutions form and represent the new middle class among the tribal population. Their representation in such institutions have been axis of tribal integration within larger Indian society. And now you will see that today in different institutions you will see that tribal communities are getting representation, whether it is in terms of employment, whether it is in terms of political institutions, whether it is in terms of higher educational institutions. And all of this played a very important role in terms of integrating the communities within the larger national within the larger national culture. So, however, in contrast to the state-led integration of the new middle class, the market also have been a very important player in integrating the tribal middle class, including the landowners, the traders and the shopkeepers. Now, I have been reiterating this point again and again that the idea of the middle class is a very diverse, is a very loose concept. As such, when we are talking about the middle class, we cannot only talk about the educated class. Another very important component of this new middle class, the tribal new middle class, is those who are engaged in self-employment or those who are engaged in economic activities, which include landowners, traders and shopkeepers, and by which the market also play a very important role in terms of integrating this section of population. So, tribes today are intricately integrated with the rest of Indian society through participation in the state and market institutions. In this context, the role of the middle class has been pivotal. So, through this lecture, what we are seeing is that the integration of tribal communities within the larger Indian society, one cannot but talk about the role and contribution of the tribal middle class. And a very important starting point to really understand the process of the formation or the emergence of middle class in tribal society is the colonial period. And during colonial period, it was the introduction of modern education that provide a catalyst for the emergence of the new middle class. And even till today, if you look at many states in the northeast in particular, like Mizoram, Nagaland, Meghalaya, Manipur, you will see that these are communities, these are states which have a very high literacy rate, which are quite educated. Essentially, the history of this goes back to the colonial period. And today the middle class in these states also constitute the educated class, people who are educated. The educated class constitute a very important section within the tribal middle class. At the same time, like I said, that the category middle class is a very fluid category, it is a very diverse category, and there are different categories, different people with different occupations who are part of this larger middle class. So, on the one hand, we have the impact of the colonial state. On the other hand, the post-colonial state, the government of India also played a very important role in terms of providing provisions that will enable the community to economically improve their condition. And this is evident in terms of the constitutional provisions of political autonomy or the constitutional provisions in terms of reservation. Now, all of this work in favor of the tribes in terms of bringing them closer to the larger Indian society, but at the same time also in terms of creating a new section within the society which many a times played a very important role in terms of articulating the interests and voicing the concern of the communities. So, understanding the tribal middle class today even within the tribal communities is very complex, and definitely there can be regional variations in terms of the nature of the middle class, but the broader context that we have talked about today is very important for us to understand the kind of changes that tribal communities are witnessing, and these changes has come about with the emergence of tribal middle class. So, today's lecture is primarily based on the publication of Professor Virginesh Khakha, Tribal Middle Class in India in Sociological Bulletin. So, we will be sharing these readings, and in the next lecture we will continue to talk about the kind of socio-economic change tribal communities have witnessed, particularly in the post-reform period. Thank you so much.